Yes.
Thank you, AJ. And we are only going to record the piece that is with the panelists. The Q&A will not be recorded. However, we want to make sure that this is available for folks who are not able to be here and serve as a resource for time to come. Um, so thank you everybody for joining us today. And some more access information is generally I will say my name before I speak so you know who's talking. If folks could also speak clearly and at a relatively slow pace for the captioners and the interpreters, that would be greatly appreciated. But other than that, we are good to go and get started. So, can you all tell us a bit about yourself, your career, how you got to where you are today? Why don't I start with Anupa's first on my screen?
Hi, thanks so much, Marissa. My name is Anupa Geevarghese. I am a brown woman with long black hair wearing a gray turtleneck. Up until this or last Friday, I served as the Deputy Director for the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. I have quite a bit of background in disability employment. I graduated from law school in 2011. And my last semester of law school, I actually got an internship or an externship actually with Feldblum, who was a commissioner at the EEOC. So I think a lesson there is like take those externships, build those connections. It was my first time coming to DC. And I got a chance just by externing with her to really build a network. Every time I would see people go up, escort folks in the elevator, like I would do background research on who they were and what their passions were, and then like kind of talk to them in the elevator to get their business card. So I worked for High as an extern. After I graduated, I got a 1 year fellowship through my law school to work for the Mental Disability Advocacy Center. That was a Open Society Foundation organization. They are no longer in existence. But at the time, I received funding to go do a 1 year study partly in South Africa around sexual violence and abuse of women and girls with disabilities. While I was there, I realized that, my passion is in employment law because of my own connection as a person with a psychiatric disability and how employment shaped my life. And so when I came back to the US, I really wanted to work in employment. And I didn't know how to get there. And so I got an opportunity to intern for High after I, took the bar. And through that, she was able to bring me on board as a confidential assistant through the Schedule A hiring authority. And another life lesson there is sometimes you take positions that maybe they don't have the attorney title, but you get to work with some amazing people and do good work. And that's exactly what I got to do while working for Kai, including getting to work on guidance around the Schedule A hiring authority. And most meaningful to me was actually getting to work on the Section 501 regulations. And by doing that, I was able to open up another door in the Office of Federal Operations, which was an office within the EEOC that focused on federal sector EEO. And since they would be the office implementing 501, they were able to pick me up. I was picked up as a workforce analyst, and I bring up these titles for folks who are thinking about federal careers because sometimes titles do matter. And so I got to do some amazing work implementing 501 once it became a final rule. We, were able to get federal agencies across the board to adopt the rule, write affirmative action plans, did trainings, wrote some of the management directive that came out with that. But after 3 years of being there, or actually, sorry, 5 years of being there, I realized like I wanted more opportunities for myself, and the title that I was in limited me. And so I decided I was going to go outside of the government. And I got an opportunity to work through Joyce Bender as a consultant with the Department of Defense in their Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And while I was there, I got to work on, work within DoD, which is a world of its own. It's got a 200-page manual on how you write for DoD. I think it was an incredible experience for me. Um, Getting to work on their disability portfolio as an attorney advisor. So I was there for 2 years, and then I got a call to serve in the administration as chief of staff to the Office of Disability Employment Policy and the amazing Assistant Secretary Taryn Williams. And while I was in her office, I got to basically do everything that the office touched, lead a number of initiatives around artificial intelligence, mental health in the workplace, good jobs and equity, and most excitingly, the Section 14C NPRM. And while I was there, I was asked by the acting Secretary of Labor to come and serve as the Deputy Director for the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. And I was there for about 4 months. And then unfortunately, things happen. That's the nature of being part of the administration. And but I was honored to serve for the last 2.5 years and thinking about what comes forward. And hopefully it'll be in the disability area. But that's my background.
This is Marissa. Thank you, Anupa. And I was not kidding when I said we had an all-star panel here. I mean, these are folks who have served as incredible mentors, not only to me, but to so many folks in our community. Okay, Kai, you are next on my screen.
Excellent. And I'm so glad that this is getting recorded and people hopefully will be able to see it because I just love the idea of people hearing Anupa's, trajectory, including just to say two things. One is don't necessarily get hung up by the title, right? What you want to do is figure out who you're working for. I had no legal opening but had a confidential assistant, right? And you go in knowing, what are the possibilities. And I could tell you many things about all the great things Anupa did, but I won't. I mean, for me, it's so I'll say white woman wearing glasses, short hair. Um, a lot of my blind friends actually say they really don't need to hear about that. So I figure what's good is for all the sighted people who don't know that I'm also a lesbian and don't know that I have a psychiatric disorder of anxiety disorder. So I just figure if I ever introduce myself with that, I'm helping both blind and sighted by saying who I am. And I mean, essentially, I've been doing disability rights like the last almost 40 years as a law professor, but a professor who came to Georgetown to set up a legislation clinic after being the legislative lawyer for the ADA from 1988 to 1990. Had a great time working with folks in the clinic. Fortunate enough to go over to the EEOC as a commissioner for about 9 years. Very fortunate to have fantastic people working with me, including Marissa for a short period of time. And then I spent 2 years doing really sort of workplace culture change within a management law firm, because that was one way to get to large companies. But I'm a policy gal, that's who I am. And I like challenges. And so I had a challenge for the last 4 years as vice chair of the AbilityOne Commission, an agency with a lot of potential for hiring people with disabilities, but really needs significant change, including getting rid of 14C, which we did 3 years ago in all the contracts. And I got my email from the White House 2 nights ago telling me that the president would like my resignation letter. And if they didn't receive the resignation letter, I'd be terminated by the end of today. So you'll be shocked. I did not send in a resignation letter. And so I'm just waiting for the email that says goodbye. But I've already decided, okay, well, let's just start an organization on the outside. I don't know what it's going to be called, right? But the tagline is going to be Community for Disability Employment and Federal Procurement. Leveraging federal procurement to increase employment for people with significant disabilities. So stay tuned. It'll have a website in about a week. So back over to you, Marissa.
This is Marissa. Thank you. We'll have to share that. So give the interpreters a second to switch over. Okay, there we go. All right, Qudsiya, you are next on my screen.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me okay, Marissa? And everybody else?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, and I think I got my video to work miraculously. Hello, everyone. So I first want to say I personally am like incredibly humbled that I was even invited to be on this panel with these incredible luminaries, and I am enjoying myself listening to all your stories. So thank you. My name is Qudsiya Naqui, she, her pronouns. I am South Asian woman with curly shoulder-length hair, dark eyes. I'm wearing a green turtleneck with a black blazer. I currently serve as senior counsel in the Office for Access to Justice at the Department of Justice. I've been in this role for just shy of 2 years, so I am very new to federal service, and I am kind of in a staff level career role, so I can certainly share kind of that perspective and what it's like to be really very new to federal government. So I have a sort of interesting trajectory, and I want to make sure we get to Karla, so I'll try to summarize as quickly as I can. And I think that my story is very much an example of kind of something that Anupa was touching on earlier, is that like your path may seem sort of circuitous, but then it all kind of comes together. I actually, really became interested in issues related to access to justice when I was in college. I worked in my first legal services organization when I was 19, as a freshman in college, and I really fell in love with that work, really became interested in ensuring that people, especially folks who are poor, people from marginalized communities, immigrants, have access to the legal assistance that they need to deal with legal problems. And that has been a through line for my career. Now that I can look back, I can find the through line. It wasn't quite clear at first. But yeah, I did that work. And after law school, I really wanted to do immigration policy work. And so I was told by many folks that I spoke to that, you really need to be in the trenches and represent people to understand how broken the system truly is. And I did that for about a year. I realized that kind of direct services litigation wasn't for me. I'm blind, I have a degenerative eye condition. So my relationship with disability has really evolved over time as I have come to understand, respect, accept, embrace my vision loss, which has been a journey for me. So I decided that litigation wasn't for me, and I went and I worked at a think tank called the Vera Institute of Justice in their Center on Immigration and Justice. And I was working on federal contracts, actually, that provided legal services to folks in deportation proceedings, specifically unaccompanied immigrant children. And that was my first kind of exposure to this intersection of disability and immigration, which is something that I continued to pursue later on. As we would see kids who are deaf and who are Indigenous language speakers or home signers, kids with all sorts of different types of disabilities in a system that just simply was not designed for them in any way. So that was a really interesting experience for me. I went on to go to an organization called Equal Justice Work. So I gained some experience running these legal services, national level legal services programs. And then Equal Justice Works had a grant from the Department of Justice to provide direct representation to unaccompanied children in deportation using kind of a fellowship model where they would recruit these postgraduate legal fellows. And they didn't have anyone on their staff who really knew anything about the unaccompanied children sort of system. And so I was able to get connected to them and came and actually like ran that program and managed it. So I went from being kind of on a staff to like leading a program and designing it and running it. And then from there, I decided I wanted to take a different direction. And I went to the Pew Charitable Trusts, where I was doing empirical research on access to state civil courts. So I was really interested in research. I kind of have this like academic bent, and that was a really great experience. And at the same time, I was also able to get a visiting professor position at CUNY Law School in New York, where I was also teaching in their immigration clinic, continuing to do work at the intersection of immigration and disability. I curated a curriculum for the students in the clinic, trying to help them understand how ableism operates in the immigration system. And so I was kind of, no one should do this, but I kind of had like a couple of jobs at the same time. It was nuts. And then the Office for Access to Justice, which had initially been started in the Obama administration, was reinvigorated in 2021 when the Biden administration came in. And a mentor of mine, and I'll talk more about why mentors are so important later on, really encouraged me to apply. And that's how I ended up. I was kind of unsure about going into the federal government, but I came in and really got to understand federal policy making from the inside. I had kind of seen the outside of that work, working on federal contracts and grants. But it's been an amazing journey to sort of see how work happens on the inside. And I really firmly believe that for those who do advocacy, it's really important to understand that. And getting inside and being a federal employee is the one way of doing that.
This is Marissa. Thank you. And evidence from all of these folks that life kind of just works out sometimes. All right, last but not least, we have Karla.
Thanks, Marissa. And I just want to thank you for organizing this panel and this series of career exploration events, and excited to hear. So I know all of my co-panelists a little bit, but I've learned new things about, I think, each one of you from listening to your stories. So this has been fun for me as well. So my name is Karla Gilbride. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I am a white person with shoulder-length blonde hair. I'm wearing a sweater. I'm blind, and I don't remember details about color, so I don't know what color it is. And I am currently the general counsel of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. To talk about my journey, so one thing I have in common with Qudsiya is that I'm very new to federal service. Most of my career up until I think I actually win the award for the shortest time in the federal government because I've only been in my role for 15 months. And all of my career up until that point, with the exception of a judicial clerkship, was in the private sector. And I'll talk a little bit about that path. I went to law school wanting to do disability rights, civil rights law of some sort, but hoping to focus on disability issues. And I think this is a 6 degrees of high Feldblum situation because I went to Georgetown Law and was a student of High's, both in her admin law class and then later in her federal legislation clinic when I got to do some work on disability issues. And that was just a formative experience. I definitely consider High to be one of my mentors. And after law school, I was fortunate to get a clerkship with Judge Gould on the Ninth Circuit in Seattle, and to have another role model of one of the few federal judges with a disability, or at least who identifies as a person with a disability. And that was a really great experience to just sort of observe the way he operated and presided on the bench as a person with a disability. I then decided to take a fellowship with disability rights advocates in Berkeley and wound up staying there for 3 years. I got to work on a wide range of disability issues, both on web access, municipal emergency planning. There were a lot of cases at that time involving, cities and counties and making sure that they were including people with disabilities in their emergency plans and responses. And I also did some testing accommodations work and some kiosk accessibility for airline kiosks. And as a lawyer, it was a great, the subject matter was something I cared about, and they were also at all different stages. We had cases up on appeal, we were drafting complaints, we were filing motions for class certification. So it was really a primer of all different aspects of litigation and law practice. And I decided to sort of take that experience and broaden out to do some other types of civil rights work. So I went to a private plaintiff's firm in DC called Marion Scallett that does both wage and hour and employment discrimination and housing discrimination work. And I worked there for 3 years. The good thing about that experience was, I kind of diversified my practice, got a kind of broader familiarity with different statutes and different areas of law outside the ADA, and a little bit more courtroom experience. I mean, by that point, I was a little further along in my career, so I actually got to argue some motions in court and get higher levels of responsibility. But then, one thing that I was sort of missing, that for anybody on this call who's practicing and doing a lot of direct client work, and Qudsiya kind of alluded to this too. It can be pretty. You get into the weeds on these fact disputes and these discovery disputes, and kind of get bogged down in the very adversarial aspects of litigation. And I was feeling a little burned out by that, so I pivoted to Public Justice, which is also a litigation shop. It's a public interest organization in DC, but they do a lot more appellate work and focusing on some access to justice issues as well as other civil rights issues, but access to the court system. And I got to do more sort of brief writing and not so much back and forth fighting with opposing counsel about whether they're going to hand over documents. And so I was in that role for a long time. I really had a great, supervisors there who allowed me to really develop my own practice area. I became kind of an appellate expert and started bringing more disability-oriented cases. That was, I sort of had the ability to specialize and got to start kind of returning to my roots and working more on ADA stuff as well as, kind of a range of other matters. And eventually got to argue a case at the Supreme Court in 2022, which was a really cool experience. And then was tapped to become general counsel at EEOC, where I have been since October of 2023. So, definitely learned a lot from Kai, from her experiences there, and other folks who had preceded me at that agency. And also I'd had some experience, filing charges with EEOC sort of from the outside as plaintiff's counsel representing employees. And I definitely want to second what Qudsiya said at the end of her statement, which is being on the inside really gives you so much insight into the types of advocacy. If you're dealing with a federal agency from the outside, you just see it in a whole new light when you're actually there and kind of understand how things work. I would sort of say the same about clerking for a judge, because you sort of see how the court system works from the inside. And I found that certainly to be the case in terms of, being at EEOC and understanding a lot more of how that agency works. And I can talk more about that in a subsequent answer, but that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of my career.
This is Marissa. Not only did Karla argue before the Supreme Court, but she won her case and it was unanimous. So there we go. Um, for the next question, how does your disability influence the work that you do? And we can, do we want to go in reverse order? Or do we want to give Karla a rest?
I can start and we can send it back. We can do like a snake draft. So how my disability impacts what I do. Well, let me just give a little quick summary of what the EEOC does, because I'm sure people have different levels of, some people may know a lot and some people may know less. And then also specifically what the Office of General Counsel does. So the EEOC is charged with enforcement of various anti-discrimination laws, including the employment-related title of the ADA, as well as Title VII, regarding employment discrimination based on race, sex, national origin, religion, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and recently the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is a new one that we just got jurisdiction over as of 2023. So there's a few things we do with regard to the statutes. One is education and outreach, sort of informing workers of their rights and informing employers of their obligations, and trying to make sure that folks are complying. The commissioners, High and others who've served, there's 5 members of the commission, or at least it's when fully staffed, there's 5 currently. There are only 4 that are filled, but they're responsible for the policy documents like regulations and guidance documents. There is, as Anupa mentioned, the Office of Federal Operations, which handles federal sector employment. And then the Office of General Counsel that I head up focuses on litigation against private employers. So if someone, under the statutes that I mentioned, I forgot the Equal Pay Act, we also have responsibility for the Equal Pay Act. So, the way litigation would start, someone files a complaint, essentially, that they were discriminated against. If that complaint is against a private employer, and there's a finding where there's investigators that will conduct an investigation. If they ultimately find a reasonable cause that there was discrimination, then it will get referred to conciliation, which is a voluntary settlement process that the employer can resolve the matter. And if it doesn't resolve in conciliation, it gets referred over to legal, and we have the ability to litigate it. So we had 80,000 charges this past year. We can't, not all of those result in a cause finding, but even the subset that do, we can't litigate all of those. So, we have a docket of 200 and something cases nationwide. And my role is to sort of oversee that docket of cases and decide as a strategic matter which cases we should litigate, on what terms to settle them, whether to appeal, basically to sort of oversee the litigation. So how my disability influences that is that obviously it informs my knowledge on kind of a personal level of certainly what disability discrimination can look like from my experience, from experiences of other disabled people I know. I think even for other forms of discrimination that are not based on disability, there's an empathy and an understanding of some of the nuance of microaggressions and the ways that systems can perpetuate, inequality and create barriers, that I have a particular affinity or understanding from my lived experience as a person with a disability that perhaps makes it easier for me to grasp, different types of systemic discrimination and sort of the subtle ways that people are locked out of opportunities or something that may seem neutral to somebody, who doesn't have that lived experience. I may be able to draw some connections that can make that sort of come to life, and see what is actually discriminatory about it. So I think it gives me kind of the leg up on just understanding some of the issues and having an emotional intelligence around those issues, which is very helpful to kind of issue spotting and figuring out what is a pattern, what is sort of worth us pursuing as litigation because it's the type of problem that is going to recur or that is emblematic of a deeper pattern or problem and not just kind of a one-off. So that's one way I think my disability, affects. I think it gives me some authority in speaking about certain issues, which is helpful. And it helps to with prioritizing. Again, we have limited resources. We can't litigate every even meritorious or important case that comes to us. So sort of having connections to the community and an ability to kind of identify from those connections what are the most important issues, what should we be focusing on with our limited resources, what would allow us to have the most impact. So those are a few of the ways. I mean, I'm sure there are others, but just to give an overview and give other folks a chance that my disability influences what I do.
Thank you. Qudsiya?
Yeah, thanks, Marissa. And thank you for that, Karla. And I think explaining how my disability has impacted my work requires me to share a little bit more about my personal story, which I touched on a little bit. As I mentioned, I am someone who has a degenerative disability. And as a result of that, I didn't grow up really exposed to disability culture. Incidentally, my very first blind friend is among these panelists. Karla was my first blind friend, who I did not meet till I moved here to DC almost I met you about 8 years ago, but I moved to DC about 10 years ago. And so it really, I was one of those people who didn't disclose I didn't use a cane for a long time. Part of the time because I didn't need one, part of the time because I didn't and I should have. And I, didn't always disclose my disability in an employment setting because I was afraid. This a little bit later if we have time, but I did experience employment discrimination that had a huge impact on me, both, a negative impact in a lot of ways, but in some senses a positive impact in the sense that it really brought me closer to my disability identity. So, I was always, like I mentioned, interested in, doing public interest law work, working on access to justice issues, but I never really made the connection between my own lived experience and the work that I was doing because I was in environments where there was no one else really with a disability. I was often the only person, or at least the only person that had a visible disability or that disclosed. And so it was really hard. But as I mentioned, I started to see these things like these unaccompanied children with disabilities. And I would see these immigration lawyers who really didn't seem to have any understanding of disability law or disability access. It just wasn't a part of the conversation. And at first I just kind of was observing that. And then as I met more disabled people, came into disability community, those connections started to really kind of fire up in my brain. And I started to think a lot more, I would say, intersectionally about the work that I was doing. And I started to realize this field that I work in, access to justice, there was an entire body of people, a community of people who understand deeply what it means to have access, whose voices are just never at the table. So when I got to the Office for Access to Justice, and I should explain a little bit about what this tiny corner of the federal government is, it's a standalone office within DOJ. As I mentioned, it was started in the Obama administration. It was was dormant for a time period between about 2018 and 2021 when it was reinvigorated. And it's a policy office within DOJ that is tasked, for the sort of tagline is ensuring that the promises and protections of our civil and criminal legal system are available to all people. it does that in a lot of different ways. We are the federal government's main we are the liaison for the public defense community to the federal government. We house the language access coordination function within the Department of Justice. We lead and staff the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, we affectionately call LAIR, which is a collaboration between the White House Counsel's Office and the Attorney General, brings together 28 federal agencies who work together on access to justice issues. So I work in the Office of Policy in the civil section because my expertise is in the civil legal system. And I, was able, kind of like Karla in her public justice role, really coming in as a senior counsel, was really empowered to shape my portfolio. And I decided I was going to, sort of give voice and bring disability into the access to justice space and really help that community understand why we need to think in terms of disability access when we're thinking about access to justice and what we can learn when we actually have that dialogue. So I started to engage other disability stakeholders around the country. I did some training. Myself and someone from the Civil Rights Division teamed up and we did a training for immigration legal services providers who serve unaccompanied children, the programs I used to work on. We did a whole training about working with disabled unaccompanied children and kind of understanding the disability laws and how they apply in the immigration system. So, really trying to bring those things together. And I wouldn't have gotten to this place if I hadn't gotten to that place of self-acceptance and self-actualizing my disability, which was a long and difficult process. But I know that some of you on this call may have gone through that or going through that. And I have certainly felt that being able, much like what Karla was saying, bringing in that lived experience allows me to speak with authority and with authenticity. And I find that people listen and they respect what I have to say. And it's allowed me to make a difference in areas of work that I really care about. So I hope that is an encouraging story for those of you who have grappled with some of the things that I described in my experience of feeling afraid, feeling like you can't express who you are. And yeah, so hopefully that's a positive example.
This is Marissa for Access. I'm just sharing that some folks put some heart and party emojis, and Nicholas Lawson said in the chat, "This is great to hear. Thanks for sharing." Okay, hi.
So great. I also want to ask Qudsiya, have you read Judge David Tatel's memoir? Do you know about it, Vision?
Yes, actually, so something I didn't mention in my other life of my non-lawyer life, I have a podcast, which Marissa was on, called Down to the Struts, and I interviewed David Tatel about his book. So yes.
Excellent. Well, good. And now we can put in a plug both for his book and for your podcast. That's it. Successful meeting already, right?
Excellent.
Great.
And I'm coming for you next, Kai.
Okay. Well, I do think that there's a particular way in which people with non-manifest disabilities, like me, and especially when they are psychiatric disabilities, there really is a choice you have to make to come out about it, especially if it hasn't been something that has required an accommodation, which is a sort of whole other piece. So it's like you quote unquote don't have to come out. But if you do come out, it just makes such a difference. So for me, I feel like I got diagnosed with anxiety disorder just about around 1988. They were trying to deal with stuff in Congress, an amendment around AIDS, and I just had these panic attacks. I had no idea what was going on. But again, I don't feel like necessarily even at that time, 1988 to 1990, when I was working on the ADA, that I completely fully identified as a person with a disability. I actually just don't remember you know, but I know that it became much deeper after the ADA passed. I'm teaching in a law school. I'm feeling like it's important to be a mentor. And again, it just felt very important to come out as both a lesbian and as a person with a psychiatric disability. And I would give speeches to, all the LGBT groups, and I would make sure to come out as a person with a psychiatric disability. And if I was ever talking to the disability crowd, and make sure to come out as a lesbian, and in both cases saying, that's not anything you would know about me unless I come out about it. So I think for me, I think my passion for social justice just was early in me in my life. I know I got into disability because when I was clerking for Justice Blackmun, and the court had a case on Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So really, as someone who had friends who were dying of AIDS, this is 1987, that got me into disability stuff. And so I think that's the main way. I feel like it was something that was really important to send the message that there isn't an us, those of us who don't have disabilities, and a them, right? And that we are on this spectrum and on this continuum. So that's what's been important.
Thank you. Anupa?
Sure. So, like, hi, I have a psychiatric disability. But my experience was I had a whole other, after I graduated from undergrad, I'd had a whole career as a labor union organizer. But while I was an organizer, I, started having eating disorders and had several suicide attempts, and I had to take a leave from the work I was doing. And then I went into a completely different career of tech recruiting. I was living in Seattle at the time. It was like the thing to do. And I remember just like feeling unfulfilled, and wanting to be able to use my personal experience, particularly being involuntarily institutionalized and being on, Social Security benefits, um, be able to use that to make a difference. And to me, I thought like the one way I could do it was to go to law school. And I used law school as an opportunity to really explore different career paths and see what worked for me. So I had tried doing direct services work by, working by interning at a P&A. And I realized, like, while my initial goal was to actually do deinstitutionalization work, because I like remember being in the hospital and remember being locked up and waiting for someone to tell me when I could go home. I realized that the actual experience of being a lawyer doing deinstitutionalization work was much too difficult for me. I couldn't separate my personal experience and the work. And I realized I couldn't be fair to clients doing that. And so I decided to go into policy because what helped me recover was having a job, having a routine, having a paycheck, having friends, having a life of my own, right? And having been on benefits and like living at home with my parents, knowing that like I could take care of myself and live my own life was so powerful that I wanted to be able to do that for other people. And policy seemed to be the way to make that change. And so in my last semester of law school, I got an opportunity through a very like random story of how I got to intern for High. But I got to intern for High, and it was right after the EEOC had issued its updated ADA regs. And they were holding a commission meeting on employment of people with intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. And at the time, I was just a lowly intern, like sitting in the staff meeting where they were planning out like who is going to testify at this commission meeting. And they were, struggling. Kai, feel free to jump in here, to find someone with a psychiatric disability who could talk about like meaningful work. And I remember just sitting there and going, you know what? I'll do it. And and like, she was like, what? Who are you? And, but like, to me, that felt like the most powerful way to come out. And in that moment, I hadn't graduated, I didn't have a job, but I felt to be true to myself, I had to be true to my story and my experiences. And so I did. I came out by testifying at the EEOC about my psychiatric disability. And ever since then, my like promise to myself has always been to like work in environments where I am valued for my experience, but also people like value who I am, all of me. And so for the last, 2 years, I got a chance to go work for the Office of Disability Employment Policy, which was actually one of the places I had when I'd first come to DC and I was looking for jobs, had really wanted to work for, because it is a unique agency and that they are a non-regulatory, non-enforcement agency that uses policy development to really change employment practices around people with disabilities. So my whole career has been shaped by my personal experiences and a belief in staying true to myself and my story, and also by sharing my story. When I was at EEOC and at doing training around accommodations, right? Like, that was an area where I did trainings for federal agencies. And I would get so many questions around employing people with psychiatric disabilities, and like, oh my God, can we, they require so many accommodations. What if they go crazy on the job, right? Like, literally, I would get these questions. And not only could I back it up by what the law said, but I could also say, okay, you know what? Right now you're talking to someone with a psychiatric disability, and I'm here presenting to you. So that really shows you that like people with psychiatric disabilities can do a range of things. So that is sort of my experience with how my work has, how my personal life, my personal experience as a person with a disability is like, has influenced my work.
Thank you. This is Marissa. I am seeing some questions in the chat, which I'm going to reserve for assuming we have time at the end for Q&A, if that's all right. But we have a lot of great interaction in the chat. Okay, next question is, have you ever had to navigate the accommodations process in your federal job? And if so, can you tell us about it?
I mean, I'm happy to start. I think there is like formal and informal accommodations, right? So, while and in different stages of your life where you may need accommodations based on your disability, and times where you may not. So, when I was working for High, I had an open office, and I also had ADHD. And the office environment meant like I would be, and the role required like dealing with a lot of stuff um, at one time. But there was also times where I needed to focus. And so, after a lot of trial and error, we came up with a system I actually borrowed from the autistic community around using color-coded cards of, red, yellow, green, which I adopted and sort of stuck in my cubicle to say like, green meant come and talk to me, yellow, is it urgent, and red, I'm really busy. And that was an informal accommodation. A formal accommodation that I had was at a different stage in my life where I was traveling a lot. I was having a lot of PTSD experiences, and really, and I'd had a service dog at the time. And I needed to travel with my dog. And that I actually had to submit a formal request, in addition to traveling with my dog, because my dog would be coming with me, but she wouldn't necessarily be coming to the presentations I would be doing. I would need the agency to extend my hotel stay by a few hours, or they would have to pay for the extra day so that my dog could be in the room while I presented. And so in that case, like, I had to actually submit a letter from my psychiatrist indicating, here is my condition, here is why I need the dog, and why I only need the dog for when I travel. My EEOC was really accommodating and supporting, and they did grant me that accommodation.
Thank you for sharing. I don't know that anybody else, does anybody else want to add, or should we move to the next question? Okay. So have you ever encountered ableism in the workplace? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about your experience and how you navigated it?
This is Qudsiya. I'm happy to chime in quickly about that since I alluded to that earlier. Yeah, so very early in my career, which is such a tender time for something like this to happen, I did have such an experience. And so I was experiencing, and I think, it's very, when you are experiencing a sort of degenerative condition where your sort of abilities are changing over time, there's, at least, and maybe this is just me, but there's definitely like kind of a lag in, trying to figure out what resources, what tools you need to adjust. And that's really what I was going through when, I started my career as a lawyer after I graduated law school. I mean, I had actually made the transition from being able to read print into like voice, text to voice in law school. But, my needs were kind of evolving. And I didn't have the vocabulary to explain what was going on and why I needed what I needed and when. And I think that was really hard. And the employer that I was dealing with, had just sort of like was not working with me to give me what I needed, and then was sort of translating any fallout from that as sort of performance issues. And I was really struggling, and it was really getting to be a hard relationship. And very fortunately, I had a dear friend who was working in the same institution, and she really encouraged me to go to an employment lawyer. I'm in a room full of them with 3 employment lawyers. So she really forced me into this, and in a good way. And she said, just go and like do like a know your rights. And that was really helpful. And then when the situation escalated, that lawyer really helped me, was able to help me get a settlement, get out of a very toxic, abusive situation, and feel a sense of justice. And that was really the first time I had ever had someone advocate for me in that way, in respect to what my rights were and what I deserved as a person with disability in the workplace. And that was transformative. And I think that really also redoubled my interest and my passion for access to justice in many ways, because what that lawyer did for me was legal empowerment. She helped me understand my rights. And so when I walk into any new employment situation, I would say my federal position included, I sort of have the tools and the vocabulary to, figure out what I need. It's a lot. I mean, it becomes a lot easier as you're more senior in your career. And when you're a little bit more like, forgive me, but just kind of like, I don't care anymore. Like, I'm disabled. What do you want me to do? Like, I'm blind. And you can kind of walk in and you have that, a little bit more of that gravitas and experience of saying, here's what I need, and then I can do my job very well. So it was a combination of knowing my rights, feeling empowered, and also, of course, like, having figured out over time what are the tools that I need, to be successful, and knowing how to use them well. So that was kind of my experience. And I, as a consequence, when I mentor disabled law students and things, I mean, I think just knowing your rights is so important. And that's why, like, Andolpa is so important as well. I wish this organization existed, Marissa, when I was a junior attorney, because having a place to ask people questions and figure out whether or not you are in fact experiencing discrimination, if this is right or wrong, what you should do about it, having that base of support and like a pipeline of supportive mentors is really key. And I've really worked hard to build that for myself as well. So those are some of the things I learned from that experience.
This is Marissa. Thank you. Does anybody else want to add anything about any ableism they've encountered in the workplace? Okay. So how does your current or former agency foster access and inclusion for employees? How can it improve?
I can take a crack at that question. This is Karla. So, at the EEOC, obviously, we do know your rights presentations, and also, do outreach geared towards employers about what the ADA requires. And the ADA is actually a very, it seems like a very a topic on which people are often asking for presentations. There are a lot of questions about how the ADA and what accommodations, should be granted and what sort of medical documentation employers can ask for to justify an accommodation. And so those outreach and education component is we cover a lot of different issues, but disability and accommodation is a very big part of what we educate employers and workers on. The litigation that I do, and well, I don't personally do. I oversee other people who are actually in court doing it. But out of the 111 cases that we filed this past year, I think 48 of them were ADA cases, so nearly half. And that covers a wide range of individual failure to accommodate, failure to hire. There's some pretty egregious. The employer finds out the person has a disability and immediately kind of cuts off the interview or cancels the interview. Just horrendous. Hiring discrimination. The cases that I find very that cover multiple people, and of course even the individual failure to accommodate and failure to hire cases, I hope will send a message that's broader beyond that one person to kind of signal that, hey, this is unlawful, and if you continue to do it, the government's going to come after you. But in terms of kind of bang for your buck policy change from one single employer, I'm particularly excited about some of our big cases that target employers that have discriminatory policies to limit leave, for example. So you get, a certain amount of leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, but if you're a new employee, you're not eligible for that leave yet, or if the employer is, below a certain threshold, they don't have to grant FMLA leave, or you exhaust your FMLA leave. And a lot of employers will say, well, in that case, we can now fire you. Your rights, you've exhausted your leave. You have no further rights, not realizing that you may also need additional leave as an accommodation for a disability. And that's a very common problem or violation that we see employers doing. And so we have cases that go at those policies, employer wide. Another one we see is, if you need to come back with a note from your doctor releasing you to full duty with no restrictions, which again, just ignores the fact that you may need accommodations and you are still qualified to do your job. And so those are policies that we go at, as well as eligibility criteria that screen people out, at the front end. And there's quite a few of those that we're currently litigating. So those are some of the litigation related things. Another point I wanted to make, about the ADA regs, since a couple people have mentioned them. I'm very excited that in a case that another part of my job as general counsel is to oversee our amicus program, which is to file briefs in cases that are not EEOC cases, that are private cases, but where, we have an interest in the outcome because it involves anti-discrimination law. And so we filed an amicus brief in a First Circuit case involving someone who brought an ADA claim against his employer, and the district court said his condition was temporary, so he didn't have an ADA qualifying disability. Basically, used the pre-ADA amendments definition of disability, which is something we see courts unfortunately doing a lot. And we filed a brief. This is significant to me because the Supreme Court had come down with their decision in Loper Bright last year that's talked about, not granting as much deference as had previously been granted to administrative agency rulemaking. But there were some exceptions or some carve-outs in that opinion, and one of them is when the agency is told by Congress to make a regulation defining statutory terms. And when Congress amended the ADA, it directed EEOC to amend its regulations to address and spell out the new definition of disability that would make it easier for people to establish that they had a disability, basically to undo the bad court decisions that had come down in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so we pointed out in our amicus brief that, our definition of disability in the reg was something Congress specifically told us to do, which means that the court should defer to it, even in spite of Loper Bright. And the court in the First Circuit decision in the Sutherland case, which just came down last week, agreed with us and made a whole several sentence long discussion of how our regulations, the EEOC's ADA regulations, need to continue to be given deference. So I'm really excited about that. I think that will have, forward-looking implications for those regulations continuing to have an effect. So those are good things. What could we be doing better? So one thing that I've been frustrated by is the continuing inaccessibility of our charge filing process for members of the public. It's something that there's ongoing work being done. There's contracts with vendors and needing to get out of those contracts and get into contracts with vendors who will do a better job. And it takes a while, but they're aware of the problem and are working on it. But that is something that I am frustrated by, that we're not complying with our obligations under 508 to have a process that is just as independently usable for people with disabilities as for people without disabilities. In terms of our work for employees and how the accommodations process is there, I've heard mixed reviews. I think some people have had good experiences. Some people are frustrated. I think there could be more centralization of those functions to sort of expedite the process. It tends to be kind of office by office, which is true, I think, for a lot of larger employers. And the EEOC is a pretty large employer with people all over the country, and so sort of your mileage can vary depending on who you're dealing with for your particular accommodations request. I will say for me, when I came in, I was waiting to be confirmed by the Senate to my position for over a year. And one thing that I heard when I got to started my job is that, we've been doing all this work to, make sure all of our employee facing documents are 508 compliant because we knew you were coming. And that was a frustrating thing to hear because it shouldn't take, knowing that, a high-ranking person is coming, that stuff should have been accessible to begin with. And when most people start a job, they don't have like a 16-month waiting period for people to, the employer to kind of get its house in order. So that was, I think the people who were talking about it were excited that it had been, moved up the priority list, but was in my view indicative that of a lack of prioritization before, and I think that given what our agency does was disappointing that it wasn't something that they had prioritized before, knowing that they had a blind person coming in at a high leadership level, and they should have accessible documents waiting for me when I got there. So those are some areas for improvement.
Thank you. I see Qudsiya coming off mute.
We just want to make sure, did hire Anupa went away, and I had a quick thing I wanted to add.
I have one thing to add, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback right off of what Karla was just saying. I too, because I am not a high-ranking official, I had a lot of struggle with documents that were not 508 compliant, and just I think there was a real difficulty helping people understand that if I can't read this document, I can't meet your deadline. And that was really took a lot of educating. My office has come a long way, but it took a lot of work that I was having to do in addition to my other duties. And the other thing I wanted to mention, just in relation to what Karla is describing, what I discovered in the course of my work at the Department of Justice, interestingly, is that there is no, so the 504 regs for DOJ, the conducted regs, the federally conducted regs for the Department of Justice have not been updated since, I think, 1984. And there is no coordinating function for DOJ conducted programs. So for instance, if you are a non-citizen in removal proceedings under the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which is a component of the Department of Justice, there's sort of no centralized coordinating function. If you are a prisoner in a Federal Bureau of Prisons facility, there's no some of these agencies have their own internal processes for requesting things like reasonable accommodations and access, but there's no centralized coordinating function that doesn't sort of live anywhere in the department. And that was, rather shocking and surprising to see, especially given that DOJ, as many of you know, also houses the disability rights section of the Civil Rights Division, which is tasked with enforcing the ADA.
Thank you. Hi.
Yeah, I think both of these comments actually underscore that you cannot assume that just because a federal agency is focused on civil rights, or just because you have a nonprofit organization that cares about civil rights, that they're actually going to be smart about accommodations. It's just not necessarily going to be the case. It might be that some large corporation or the USDA, I mean, who knows, right, could end up being better. And really what it takes is coming forward, feeling like you can own that right to ask for an accommodation. And of course, such a difference whether you're coming in as the general counsel, right, Senate confirmed, or you're coming in as entry level, mid-level, right? But if there's one thing we can do for each other, it is absolutely supporting the person's internal sense of empowerment. Right. But that means it can't be just on that person, right? It has to be that there's a community behind us. And so one thing I will say in terms of don't assume, just because the agency is doing civil rights, right, that they're going to be on top of this. When I came onto the EEOC in 2009, again, Senate confirmed, right? And turns out my spouse and I were in California. We were going to do a road trip driving from California back to DC. And then I was going to be starting the job. And I said to one of my Democratic colleague commissioners, oh, you know what? What I'll do is I'll stop at EEOC offices on this road trip, meet the staff, meet with the disability affinity group, meet with the LGBT affinity group, you know, in each of these offices. And he looked at me and he cracked up. He says, hi, we do not have an employee disability affinity group here, and we don't have an LGBT affinity group at the EEOC. Now, mind you, Anupa made sure to start one when she was there for the disability, and they also started an LGBT group. But it is, again, it's almost like you need someone at higher leadership, right, to sometimes get things going. And so I think we're all in this community together.
If I could just like piggyback on this point, sorry, this is turning more into a discussion, but when we were working on, the 501 regs, but also in all of the sort of more recent research that ODEP has done through the Federal Exchange on Employment and Disability, right? What we found is that in order to, and this is kind of like a no-brainer, in order to create change, you really need a commitment from leadership. And so when you also have disabled leaders, which I think the percentage in like of disabled SES is like, 0 or just a little bit above that, right? Is that when you have disabled leaders, you then do have folks who are influencing a shift. The other thing I think, going back to when we were working on the 501 regs, was that we did notice that across the board, federal agencies didn't have clear processes for reasonable accommodations, right? And that was why, like, that portion of the regs is so prescriptive. Like, it literally lists out 20 things with different subparts on what agencies must have in their accommodation procedures. And like during my time at EEOC, a lot of what I did was redline agency procedures to help them understand, like, no, you can't just ask everybody for medical documentation. No, you can't, take 3 months to get back to someone. That's not like responding in an expedited fashion, right? So like that portion, the reason that's so prescriptive is to really help agencies have clear procedures and processes so that employees understand what's required of them and the agencies know what they need to do. That doesn't mean it's always followed, but that's like the intent of it, is to really show people what the process should look like ideally.
This is Marissa. Thanks, Anupa, and no apologies necessary because these discussions are really important to have, and that's why we have this event. So kind of to close us out, what advice do you have for disabled legal professionals who are looking for employment with a federal agency? And, given the current state of affairs, gestures vaguely about everything, in the federal government, what do you see as the benefit of being in a federal agency at some point in your career?
This
Can
is
we let,
Qudsiya.
oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. No, you please.
No, I was gonna
Hi.
ask Hi to start because she hasn't led off one of these sessions yet.
Well, here's what I would say. It is so absolutely useful if you are a lawyer to be on the inside and not just on the outside. So this is reinforcing something that Karla said. You really don't have a sense of how the government system works until you come inside the government system. When I started as a commissioner, after about 2 months, I said, I feel like I should have been given a dictionary and a passport before I came into this job, because it was like a sort of different world in terms of the federal government. And it's not only in terms of how the federal government works, but it's also about role assumption. Right? So I was an advocate for years and years, as I was an advocate in Congress, right, for usually disability issues, other social justice issues. And that's a certain role you have as a lawyer. That's your client, right? And then inside the government agency, you have a particular role to play. I mean, the client is often like the law that you're enforcing. Again, it's somewhat different if you're doing policy, and there it is, in fact, enforcing the policy of the current administration and moving that forward. So I absolutely believe that it is a useful thing to try to do. Just know that you might need a passport and a dictionary when you get in there. But I will also say, and the five of us talked, by email before tonight to say, this moment in time is not the moment in time to probably try to go in unless you're going to be there to help Qudsiya, survive. Um, I really do not want anyone who's there to leave. Um, but and at a certain level within the federal government, it could still be fine. But I think to me, the issue is more that it is a useful thing to do at one point in your career.
This is Marissa, noting we also just saw that all of the honors attorney offers were unfortunately rescinded, so it's definitely going to be a difficult time. Okay. Who wants to go next to close us out? Qudsiya, did you want to go?
I'm going to pass it to Karla.
Okay. Well, I don't want to belabor the inside outside thing, which I think others have already said. So just to add to that, I think it depends, both when, as Kai alluded to, but also kind of the what. I think the point that it doesn't have to be a legal role. I think that, internships, especially for people early on in their career, just to kind of get internships or sort of a short stint, even academic year, during law school can give you a flavor for what different agencies do and what different components of those agencies do, the policy work, that there's a lot of different little nooks and crannies within all of these federal agencies. And so getting to know people who are working in those roles as mentors, getting to know people, who either are currently or have previously worked in federal agencies to maybe give you a little bit of a cheat sheet. Definitely agree that you're going to need a dictionary because there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of internal jargon. So if you can, find somebody who can kind of translate some of that for you and give you some pointers, the sooner you can do that as a student or as an early, career person, even if you're not in the federal government yet, finding connections with people who can show you the ropes a little bit may help you to identify those opportunities.
Thank you. Go ahead, Anupa.
Okay, yeah, well, I was going to say a couple things. One, if you are thinking about internships, think about the Workforce Recruitment Program, which is a program co-managed by DOL's ODEP and the Department of Defense, which is an internship program for students and recent graduates with disabilities. So really go, look into that if you are a student or recent graduate. For me, my experience is a little different because my entire legal career has been in the federal government, just at different agencies and in different capacities. So I was a term appointee, which means I was hired, but for a certain time period that was tied to someone else. I was a career federal employee, so I had all of the rights and benefits of being a Fed. Then I was a federal contractor at the Department of Defense, and then I was a political appointee. So I've been at 3 different departments and in 3 to 4 different capacities. And for me, I have learned, working for the EEOC, which is Civil Rights Enforcement Agency, and then going to work for the DoD, where, civil rights isn't their priority. It meant, really advocating for your issues. And sometimes, having to reconcile that the thing that you or your office is really pushing for is not the priority. And there's a valuable lesson in that, that I took away from my time there. And one of the things that I had worked on for 2 years was to finalize their 504 and 508 rules, which hadn't been updated since 1982. And we had a final copy, we had a final rule, it was all done. It just needed to get, papers pushed forward within the department, and it just wasn't a priority. And so that's like a hard lesson to accept, but it's just part of your career journey. So I just sort of think that there's like an incredible lessons that you can get from being a Fed, but also there is a privilege in being part of the government and really serving the people and seeing the work that you've done kind of come out in a reg book. And it's like very nerdy and very exciting.
Thank you, Anupa. I love that for you. And Qudsiya, last but not least.
Yeah, and Marissa, I just want to, like, before I say my last piece, I just want to say thank you to you. I have really appreciated this space, especially this week. So thank you. It's been fun to hang out with you all for a little bit. I don't want to repeat everything that all of these three, like I said, luminaries have said is incredibly wise. I guess I'll close this out with just a reflection from my short experience in the federal government. Something that really struck me and that has been is something that I'm going to carry with me in whatever I do next is, whatever you may think and however hard it is, and all the stuff Anupa was describing about your issue not being the priority and having to be patient. And it's like moving a mountain. But one thing I have observed about people who work in federal service and the wonderful colleagues I've had the privilege of working with is the incredible dedication to the service that they bring to the work. That has really been an inspiration to me in the truest sense of that word. It has really enlivened me into action. I've really learned about how you just don't give up, and where there's a will, there's a way. And I just have been so blown away by how much people really care about what they're doing. They care about doing right in the world. And I just hope I've really valued that spirit, and that is something I will always carry with me from this experience.
This is Marissa. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I am realizing we only have 4 minutes left, so probably not enough time to actually get to Q&A. But I encourage folks who have questions, or still have questions after, feel free to email me, or info@ndalpa.org, and I'm happy to pass those questions along to our lovely panelists. In case you have missed it or are not a member or not aware of our events, or other resources, I encourage you to visit ndalpa.org, ndlpa.org. This recording will also be posted on our website. I just want to thank you all so much again for joining us tonight, and thank you to Chai, Qudsiya, Karla, and Anupa, who have just been incredible mentors, have had such an incredible impact on our movement. And just thank you for everything that you do. I also want to remind folks that unfortunately our USA Jobs Bootcamp had to be canceled due to the individual no longer being authorized to participate in the event due to recent changes. But we will have a court accessibility town hall on February 25th that we will send out more information on in our newsletter. Thank you all so much again, and we hope to see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye, all.
everyone. Take care.
Thank you to the interpreters and to Mirabai. We appreciate you.